Fay Act I, the family secret. Fay. The afternoon light filtered through the Venetian blinds of St. Mary's Hospital, casting thin golden lines across the linoleum floor. Room 314 smelled of antiseptic and something else. Something that couldn't be cleaned away. Margaret Walsh sat beside the bed, her fingers intertwined with those of the man who had raised her for 38 years. Edward Walsh was dying. His breathing came in shallow, measured intervals, each one a small victory against the cancer that had been eating him alive for the past 6 months. The morphine drip kept the pain at bay, but it also kept him floating somewhere between this world and the next. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the steady beep of the heart monitor. She leaned closer, close enough to smell the faint cologne he still wore even in this sterile place. Old Spice, the same cologne he'd worn when he walked her down the aisle 12 years ago, when he'd taught her to drive in his rusty Buick, when he'd stayed up all night helping her with algebra homework. "I am here, Dad." The word came easily, naturally. It always had. Edward's eyes, one sharp and calculating from his 40 years as a small-town accountant, now struggled to focus. "The papers," he managed. "In my briefcase. Bring them." Margaret glanced at the leather briefcase that had been his constant companion, even here in his final days. She'd wondered about its contents but had never asked. Edward Walsh was a private man, methodical in everything he did. Even dying seemed to follow some invisible schedule only he could see. She retrieved the briefcase and placed it on the rolling hospital table. Edward's fingers trembled as he worked the combination. Her birthday, as always. Inside, among the usual documents and insurance papers, was a manila envelope marked "Last Will and Testament." 23 years, Edward said, his eyes meeting hers with sudden clarity. 23 years I've been meaning to change this." Margaret's heart skipped. She had assumed, as any child would, that she was his primary beneficiary. The house in Millfield, the small rental properties, the savings account he'd built over decades of careful living. She'd never questioned that it would all come to her when the time came. "Dad, you don't need to worry about." "Yes, I do." His grip on her hand tightened with surprising strength. "There is something I never told you, Maggie, about your adoption." The word hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Margaret had known she was adopted since she was 7 years old. Edward had told her the story many times. How her birth mother, his sister's best friend, had died in a car accident when Margaret was just 6 months old. How there was no father in the picture. How he'd taken her in because family was family, blood or not. "I know about the adoption, Dad. You saved me." Edward shook his head slowly. That is not the whole truth." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, and she found herself counting the seconds it took for the sound to fade completely. "Your birth mother," Edward continued, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "She wasn't just Sarah's friend. She worked for me at the firm." The heart monitor's beeping seemed to grow louder. Margaret realized she was holding her breath. Jennifer Pace. 22 years old she was. We were. Edward's voice trailed off, but Margaret understood. "You were having an affair." "I was married to your mother then." Ellen was already sick, though we didn't know it yet. Jennifer got pregnant, and she threatened to tell Ellen everything unless I left my wife. Edward's eyes closed. "I couldn't do that. Ellen needed me." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. This wasn't the adoption story she'd known her entire life. "Jennifer kept the pregnancy when you were born. She wanted money. Lots of money. I gave her what I could, but it was never enough. Then the car accident happened and—" Edward opened his eyes again, looking directly at Margaret. "And I took you in because I thought you might be mine." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "You thought?" "I was never sure Jennifer had other relationships, but when I looked at you, sometimes I could see myself." The way you held your pen, the way you tilted your head when you were thinking, I convinced myself you were my blood." Margaret stared at her hands. Hands she'd been told looked just like her adoptive mother Ellen's. Ellen, who had died of cancer when Margaret was 15. Ellen, who had loved her unconditionally, never knowing that her husband might have brought his mistress's child into their home. "The will," Edward said, gesturing weakly toward the papers. "It leaves everything to you. But if I had known for certain that you weren't mine—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Margaret looked at the will in her hands. Edward Walsh's entire estate, worth over $2 million thanks to smart investments and decades of frugality, was bequeathed to "my beloved daughter, Margaret Walsh." "But what if she wasn't his daughter at all?" "Dad," she said softly, "do you want to change it?" Edward's eyes searched her face, and for a moment she saw the man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had never missed a school play, who had walked her down the aisle to marry David, even though David came from the kind of family Edward had never quite fit in with. "I am tired, Maggie," he whispered. "I am so tired." Within an hour, Edward Walsh had slipped into a coma. The doctors said it could be hours or days. Margaret sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair and stared at the will in her lap. She thought about her own family. David and their twin boys, 10-year-old Michael and Matthew. David's pharmaceutical sales job paid well, but not well enough to send the boys to the private schools they'd been considering. Not well enough to pay off the mortgage on their house in the suburbs. Not well enough to secure the kind of future Margaret wanted for her sons. The money would change everything. But what if Edward woke up and wanted to change the will? What if, in his final lucid moments, he decided she wasn't really his daughter and left everything to some distant cousin she'd never met? Margaret looked at the unconscious man in the bed. Edward Walsh had given her everything: a name, a home, a family, love. Even if she wasn't his biological daughter, didn't 7 years of being his daughter count for something? Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "How is he doing? Boys asking about Grandpa." She typed back, "Same, might be tonight." Another buzz. This one from her brother-in-law Tom. Heard Uncle Ed took a turn. Everything okay with the estate planning? Margaret stared at that message for a long time. Tom had always been interested in Edward's money. Too interested. Edward had helped pay for Tom's business degree, had co-signed the loan for Tom's failed restaurant, had never asked for a penny back. But Tom wasn't a blood relative either. He was just married to Edward's actual niece, Susan. If Edward died without making any changes to the will, Margaret would inherit everything. If he changed it now, or if someone contested it later, claiming she had no right to the money because she wasn't really family. The ICU was quiet at 2 a.m. Most patients were sleeping, and the nursing staff made their rounds with practiced silence. Margaret had been alone with Edward for hours, when she noticed his briefcase was still open on the table. She looked at Edward's peaceful face, at the man who had been the only father she'd ever known. His breathing was so shallow now that sometimes she found herself checking to make sure he was still alive. The will was right there. All she had to do was nothing, and everything would be fine. Edward would pass away, she would inherit his estate, and her family would be secure forever. But what if someone decided to investigate? What if they demanded proof that she was really Edward's daughter? DNA tests were easy now, commonplace in estate disputes. Margaret reached for Edward's pen, the same Mont Blanc fountain pen he'd used to sign her report cards, her wedding documents, her children's birth certificates. Her hand trembled slightly as she uncapped it. All she needed to do was add one line, something simple, something that would make her legal claim unquestionable. She looked around the room. The hallway outside was empty. The nurse wouldn't make rounds for another hour. Edward's breathing continued its steady, shallow rhythm. Margaret placed the will on the bedside table and, in Edward's careful handwriting, handwriting she'd learned to forge perfectly during her teenage years when she'd forged his signature on permission slips and report cards. She added a single sentence. I acknowledge that Margaret Walsh is my biological daughter, as confirmed by paternity testing conducted in 1985. No such tests had ever been conducted. But who could prove that now? She folded the will carefully and placed it back in the briefcase. Then she sat back down in the plastic chair and waited. Edward Walsh died at 4:17 a.m. without ever regaining consciousness. Margaret held his hand as he took his final breath, and the tears that fell were real. Tears of grief, but also tears of something else. Something that felt heavy and cold and permanent. Fate the second, the betrayal. The funeral was held on a Tuesday morning in October. The leaves outside Millfield Methodist Church had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the light streaming through the stained glass windows painted everything in warm, forgiving colors. Margaret sat in the front pew, flanked by David and their sons. Behind them sat the small collection of people who had made up Edward Walsh's world, his niece Susan and her husband Tom, a few colleagues from the accounting firm where he'd worked until retirement, neighbors who remembered him as the quiet man who kept his lawn meticulously trimmed and always waved when they passed by. Reverend Matthews spoke about Edward's life of service, his devotion to family, his quiet generosity. He mentioned how Edward had taken in his young daughter after tragedy struck, raising her with the same love he would have given a biological child. Margaret listened to the words and felt something inside her twist and tighten. She glanced at Susan, who was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Susan had barely known Edward growing up. Her family had moved to California when she was young, and she'd only returned to Ohio 5 years ago when her own marriage started falling apart. After the service, they gathered in the church basement for the traditional meal of casseroles and sympathy. Margaret moved through the crowd accepting condolences, playing the role of the grieving daughter, and she was grieving. Edward's death had left a hole in her life that felt permanent and raw. I am so sorry for your loss, said Eleanor Hartman, the church secretary. Your father was such a good man, always so proud of you. Thank you, Margaret replied automatically. I remember when he first brought you to church, Eleanor continued. You were just a little thing, maybe 7 or 8. He was so nervous about being a single parent, but anyone could see how much he loved you. Margaret smiled and nodded, but inside she was calculating. Eleanor Hartman had worked at the church for 40 years. She would have been there in those early days, would have heard the story of Margaret's adoption. What version had Edward told back then? Later, as the crowd thinned, Tom approached her with what he probably thought was a sympathetic expression. Margaret, I know this isn't the time, but when you are ready, we should probably talk about Uncle Ed's estate. I know he didn't have a lot of debt, but there might be some complex tax issues with the rental properties. Margaret looked at Tom, really looked at him. He was wearing an expensive suit, she noticed. Designer watch. His restaurant had failed 3 years ago, but somehow Tom and Susan never seemed to lack for money. I think everything is pretty straightforward, Tom. Dad was very organized. Of course. But you know, legally speaking, estate law can be tricky, especially when there are questions about inheritance rights and family relationships. Margaret felt her blood go cold. What do you mean? Tom glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Look, I am not trying to cause trouble. Uncle Ed was good to all of us, but the fact is, you were adopted. And I know Uncle Ed loved you like his own, but from a legal standpoint. From a legal standpoint, I am his daughter. That is what the adoption papers say. Right, of course. I am just saying if there were ever any complications, you might want to have some documentation ready. You know, something that proves beyond any doubt that you are entitled to inherit. Margaret stared at Tom for a long moment. Are you planning to contest the will? God, no. Of course not. I am just looking out for you, making sure you are prepared for any questions that might come up. But Margaret could see it in his eyes. The calculation, the hunger. Tom knew that if Margaret's inheritance could be challenged successfully, the money might end up distributed among Edward's blood relatives, and Susan, as Edward's actual niece, would be first in line. That evening, Margaret sat in Edward's house. Her house now going through his papers. David had taken the boys home, thinking she needed time alone to grieve. And she did need time alone, but not for grief. In Edward's desk, she found a folder labeled Margaret's Documents. Inside were her adoption papers, her school records, medical files from her childhood, and at the bottom a sealed envelope marked for Margaret, to be opened only upon my death. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Femi, dear Maggie, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and there are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago. Your mother, Jennifer Pace, was not the woman I let you believe she was. She was troubled, desperate, and she used her pregnancy to try to manipulate me. When you were born, she demanded, I leave Ellen and marry her. When I refused, she threatened to tell Ellen about our affair. I paid Jennifer money to keep quiet, but it was never enough. She wanted more and more, and I began to suspect that you might not be my biological child at all. Jennifer had been involved with several men during the time you would have been conceived. I wanted to have a paternity test done, but Jennifer refused. She said she would disappear with you if I tried, so I waited, hoping that time would give me answers. When Jennifer died in that car accident, I thought my chance for the truth died with her. But I took you in anyway, because by then I loved you regardless of whose blood you carried. You were mine in every way that mattered. I want you to know that I never regretted my decision. You have been the greatest joy of my life, but I also want you to have the choice I never had, the choice to know the truth. There may be ways to find out now with modern DNA testing. If you choose to pursue it, I'll understand. And if you choose not to, I'll understand that too. Know that you are my daughter, Maggie. Blood or no blood, you are mine, and I am proud of the woman you've become. Love always. Dad P.S. I've left you everything because you've earned it, not through genetics, but through 37 years of being my child. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Edward had suspected she might not be his biological daughter, but he'd left her the inheritance anyway. The love was real, even if the bloodline wasn't, but Tom didn't know about the letter. And more importantly, Tom didn't know about the line she'd added to the will. The line claiming that paternity testing had been done in 1985, proving she was Edward's daughter. If anyone challenged the will, that line would protect her. But it would also be a lie that could potentially be exposed. Margaret looked around Edward's house, the house where she'd grown up, where she'd learned to walk and talk and become the person she was today, the house that was now worth $400,000. Combined with the rental properties and savings, Edward's estate totaled just over $2 million. $2 million that could send her sons to the best colleges, could pay off all their debts, could give them the life she'd always wanted to provide. Margaret opened her laptop and began researching probate lawyers. Act the third, the trial phase 6 months after Edward Walsh's funeral. Margaret found herself sitting across from attorney Rebecca Chen in a downtown law office that smelled of leather and expensive coffee. Rebecca was young, sharp, and came highly recommended for estate litigation. The challenge to the will was filed yesterday, Rebecca said, sliding a folder across the polished conference table. Thomas Morrison claims that as the spouse of Edward Walsh's blood niece, he and his wife have a superior claim to the estate than an adopted daughter. Margaret opened the folder with steady hands. She'd been expecting this since Tom's not, so subtle hints at the funeral. On what grounds? They're arguing that Ohio state law prioritizes blood relatives in cases where the biological relationship of the primary beneficiary is in question. They're demanding genetic testing to prove you are Edward Walsh's biological daughter. There it was. The moment Margaret had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. The will states that paternity testing was conducted in 1985, Margaret said carefully. That should be sufficient proof. Rebecca studied Margaret's face. The problem is they're demanding to see the documentation from that test. Medical records, lab reports, something concrete. Do you have access to those records? Margaret met her attorney's gaze without flinching. It was 28 years ago. I'd have to search for them. I understand. In the meantime, they're also requesting that the court order new DNA testing. Since Edward Walsh is deceased, they want to exhume the body for comparison. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. They want to dig up my father? It is not uncommon in contested estate cases, especially when significant sums are involved. However, there might be an alternative. Rebecca pulled out another document. Edward Walsh's brother, Michael, died 10 years ago, but his son, Edward's nephew, is still alive. David Kellerman lives in Phoenix. If he is willing to provide a DNA sample, we could establish whether you share genetic markers with the Walsh family line without disturbing Edward's grave. Margaret stared at the document. She'd heard Edward mention his nephew David a few times over the years, but they'd never met. He was a stranger who held the power to destroy her life. What if I refuse the testing altogether? Then the court will likely rule against you. The challengers have raised reasonable doubt about your biological relationship to the deceased. Without proof, they could successfully argue that the estate should go to Susan Morrison as the closest blood relative. Margaret nodded slowly. How long do I have to decide? The court date is set for 2 months from now, but Margaret, I have to ask, do you have any reason to believe the paternity testing mentioned in the will wasn't actually conducted? Margaret looked out the window at the city street below. People hurried past on the sidewalk, going about their normal lives, unaware that in this office a woman was deciding whether to gamble everything on a lie. I was 6 years old in 1985, Margaret said finally. I don't remember much from that time. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop screen. She'd been researching David Kellerman for hours. He was 42, worked as an engineer, had 2 daughters. His Facebook page showed a man with kind eyes and Edward's distinctive nose. David had posted a memorial message when Edward died. "Rip Uncle Ed, wish we'd stayed in better touch over the years. You were a good man." Margaret could send him a message. Explain the situation, ask for his help. Maybe he'd refuse the DNA test out of respect for Edward's wishes. Maybe he'd understand that some inheritances were about love, not genetics. But what if he didn't? Margaret closed the laptop and walked upstairs to check on her sons. Michael and Matthew were asleep in their beds, homework scattered across their desks. They'd been asking about starting travel baseball next year, an expensive commitment that would have been impossible before Edward's inheritance. But with the estate money, Margaret had already signed them up. She thought about what would happen if she lost the court case. The house would have to be sold to pay the legal fees. The boys would have to transfer to public school. David's commissions had been down this quarter, and there was talk of layoffs at his company. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd started to build with Edward's money, would be gone. Margaret returned to her laptop and opened a new browser tab. If she was going to beat a DNA test, she needed to understand exactly how DNA testing worked, and more importantly, how it could be manipulated. The research took her deep into medical journals and forensic science papers. She learned about contamination, about false positives, about the chain of custody requirements for legal DNA evidence. And she learned something else. David Kellerman had been in a serious car accident 3 years ago. According to the news reports, he'd spent 6 weeks in intensive care and had required multiple blood transfusions. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing. Blood transfusions, multiple donors. If David's DNA had been compromised by foreign blood, would that affect the test results? It was a long shot, but it might be enough to cast doubt on the results if they didn't go her way. The next morning, Margaret called Rebecca Chen's office. "I've decided to agree to the DNA testing," she told the receptionist, "but I want to use David Kellerman as the comparison subject." "I'll let Miss Chen know," the woman replied. "She'll be pleased. This should resolve everything quickly." Margaret hoped she was wrong. 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself in a sterile medical office, watching a technician swab the inside of her cheek. The process was surprisingly quick and undramatic. Just a cotton swab, a small vial, and a chain of custody form. "Results should be available in 10 to 14 business days," the technician said. "The court will receive them directly." Margaret nodded and signed the paperwork. In 2 weeks, she would know whether her 38-year relationship with Edward Walsh was built on lies, love, or some complicated combination of both. But more than that, she would know whether the addition she'd made to Edward's will would be exposed as fraud. Forth. The verdict fari, the courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected. Judge Patricia Reyes presided from behind a modest bench, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Rebecca Chen, while Tom and Susan Morrison sat across the aisle with their attorney, a theatrical man named Gerald Hoffman who looked like he belonged in a television drama. Margaret's hands were folded in her lap, but inside she was falling apart. The DNA results had arrived yesterday, and she knew what they contained. Rebecca had called her at 6 a.m. with the news. Margaret, the attorney, had said, "We need to talk." Now, as Judge Reyes called the court to order, Margaret felt like she was watching her life from outside her body. David and the boys sat in the gallery behind her, their faces tense with worry. They still believed their future was secure. They had no idea that everything was about to change. "Your Honor," Gerald Hoffman began, standing with practiced dramatics, "this case is about justice. Edward Walsh was a good man who built a considerable estate through decades of hard work and careful planning. That estate should go to his true family, not to someone who has spent 38 years living under false pretenses." Margaret wanted to stand up and scream at him. She wanted to tell the court about Christmas mornings with Edward, about him teaching her to drive, about holding her hand when she gave birth to his grandchildren. But she remained silent. Rebecca Chen rose for the defense. "Your Honor, Margaret Walsh was legally adopted by Edward Walsh in 1984. Under Ohio law, an adopted child has the same inheritance rights as a biological child. Furthermore, the will specifically states that paternity testing confirmed biological relationship. My client has been Edward Walsh's daughter in every way that matters for 38 years. Judge Reyes nodded. "I've reviewed the arguments from both sides. Mr. Hoffman, your clients are requesting DNA testing to challenge the biological relationship claim in the will. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. The alleged paternity testing mentioned in the will is highly suspicious. No medical records exist from 1985, and we believe this claim was fabricated." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She glanced at Rebecca, who gave her a warning look. "Miss Chen," the judge continued, "your client has agreed to DNA testing using Mr. David Kellerman as the comparison subject. Are the results available?" "They are, Your Honor." Rebecca stood and approached the bench with a sealed envelope. "However, we'd like to point out several issues with the testing that may affect the validity of the results." Margaret held her breath. This was the moment she'd been dreading for months. Judge Reyes opened the envelope and reviewed the documents inside. Her expression was unreadable, but Margaret noticed her pause and reread something twice. "The results indicate," Judge Reyes said slowly, "that Margaret Walsh and David Kellerman share no significant genetic markers. According to the testing laboratory, there is zero probability that they are related through a common grandfather." The courtroom was silent. Margaret felt the floor falling away beneath her. "However," the judge continued, "the laboratory has included a note about potential complications. Mr. Kellerman, would you please stand?" A man Margaret had never met rose from the gallery. He was tall, with Edward's nose and kind eyes. He looked nervous. "Mr. Kellerman, the court understands you had a significant medical event several years ago. Can you tell us about that?" David Kellerman stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. I was in a car accident in 2020. I required emergency surgery and multiple blood transfusions. I was in the ICU for 6 weeks. The DNA testing laboratory has noted that recent blood transfusions can potentially complicate genetic testing results," Judge Reyes said. "The foreign DNA from donor blood can persist in the system for years, potentially affecting test accuracy." Margaret felt a surge of hope. Her research had been correct. Gerald Hoffman stood up. "Your Honor, that is highly speculative. The science is clear. The test shows no genetic relationship." "Mr. Hoffman, you are correct that the test results are clear. However, the court must consider all factors that might affect the reliability of evidence." Judge Reyes looked at Margaret. "Miss Walsh, is there any other evidence you can provide regarding your biological relationship to Edward Walsh?" This was it. The moment where Margaret could confess everything. The forged line in the will, the uncertainty about her parentage, the lies she'd built her inheritance on. She could tell the truth and lose everything, or continue the deception and risk exposure later. Margaret stood slowly. "Your Honor, I'd like to present additional evidence." Rebecca looked at her sharply. This hadn't been part of their strategy. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out Edward's letter, the real letter he'd left her, the one that admitted he'd never been sure about her parentage. "This is a letter my father left me, to be opened after his death. With the court's permission, I'd like to read it." Rebecca was shaking her head, but Margaret had already started walking toward the bench. Judge Reyes accepted the letter and read it silently. Her expression grew more grave with each line. After several minutes, she looked up. "Miss Walsh, this letter appears to contradict your claim of proven paternity. In fact, it suggests that Edward Walsh himself was uncertain about your biological relationship." Margaret felt tears starting to form. "Yes, Your Honor, but it also says something else. It says that he loved me regardless. It says that he considered me his daughter in every way that mattered." The letter also indicates, Judge Reyes continued, that the paternity testing mentioned in the will was never actually conducted. "Miss Walsh, do you understand the implications of that statement?" Margaret looked back at David and her sons. Michael and Matthew were staring at her with confusion and fear. David's face was pale. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." There was a long silence in the courtroom. Finally, Judge Reyes spoke. "This case presents a complex intersection of legal inheritance rights and emotional family relationships. The DNA evidence suggests that Margaret Walsh is not biologically related to Edward Walsh, and Edward Walsh's own letter confirms he was uncertain about paternity. However, the letter also makes clear that Mr. Walsh considered Margaret to be his daughter regardless of genetics, and that he intended for her to inherit his estate." Margaret held her breath. Under Ohio adoption law, an adopted child maintains full inheritance rights regardless of biological relationship to the adoptive parent. The question before this court is not whether Margaret Walsh was Edward Walsh's biological daughter, but whether she was legally his daughter, and whether Edward Walsh's stated intentions regarding his estate should be honored. Judge Reyes paused, looking directly at Margaret. However, the court is deeply troubled by the apparent false statement in the will regarding paternity testing conducted in 1985. This appears to be a deliberate misrepresentation of fact. Margaret's legs felt weak. This was it. She was going to be charged with fraud. Miss Walsh, did you have any role in the creation or modification of the statement regarding paternity testing in your father's will? Margaret looked at Rebecca, who was staring at her with growing alarm. She looked at Tom Morrison, who had a satisfied smirk on his face. She looked at her sons, who deserved better than a mother who built their future on lies. Yes, Your Honor, I added that line to the will, while my father was unconscious in the hospital. He never knew about it. The courtroom erupted. David shot to his feet, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. Rebecca was frantically shuffling papers, probably figuring out how to withdraw from the case. Tom Morrison looked like he'd won the lottery. Judge Reyes banged her gavel. Order in the court. When the room was quiet again, she continued, Miss Walsh, you've admitted to willfully falsifying a legal document. This is a serious criminal matter that will be referred to the district attorney's office. However, for the purposes of this inheritance dispute, the court must determine the correct distribution of Edward Walsh's estate, based on his actual intentions, not on fraudulent additions to his will. Margaret felt numb. She was going to lose everything, and she was probably going to jail. The court finds that Edward Walsh's letter clearly expresses his intention for Margaret Walsh to inherit his estate, regardless of biological relationship. While Miss Walsh's actions in falsifying the will are reprehensible and will be addressed separately, they do not change the fundamental fact that Edward Walsh wanted his adopted daughter to be his beneficiary. Margaret stared at the judge. What was happening? However, Judge Reyes continued, the court also finds that Margaret Walsh's fraudulent actions have irreparably damaged the integrity of the will. Therefore, the estate will be distributed according to Ohio intestacy laws, which recognize adopted children as equal to biological children for inheritance purposes. The judge shuffled her papers. The estate of Edward Walsh will be distributed to Margaret Walsh as his legal heir. The challenge to the will is dismissed. Margaret sank into her chair. She'd won. She'd kept the inheritance, but she'd also confessed to fraud in open court. Judge Reyes wasn't finished. Miss Walsh, while you will inherit your father's estate, you should know that the district attorney will likely file charges for document fraud. You may want to consult with criminal counsel. As the court adjourned, Margaret sat motionless at the plaintiff's table. Rebecca Chen was packing her briefcase with sharp, angry movements. I can't represent you on the criminal matter, Rebecca said without looking at Margaret. What you did was incredibly stupid and unnecessary. You would have won anyway based on the adoption alone. Margaret nodded numbly. She'd committed fraud to protect an inheritance that was already legally hers. David approached the table slowly. His face was hurt and confused. Maggie, he said quietly, why? Why would you do something like that? We didn't need the money that badly. But they had needed it, or at least, Margaret had convinced herself they did. She'd needed it to feel secure, to feel worthy of the life Edward had given her. I was scared, she said. I was scared of losing everything. You've lost something else instead, David replied. You've lost who you used to be. Epilogue. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of Edward Walsh's house. Her house now, legally and completely. The criminal charges had been reduced to a misdemeanor fraud conviction with community service and probation, partly due to her confession and partly due to the unique circumstances of the case. The boys were adjusting to their new reality. The inheritance money was still there, still providing for their education and their future, but it felt different now. Heavier, every dollar carried the weight of what she'd done to secure it. David had moved out 3 weeks after the trial. He still saw the boys regularly, but their marriage had become another casualty of Margaret's deception. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. Margaret walked through the house, touching the familiar objects that had surrounded her childhood. Edward's reading chair, still positioned by the window, where he liked to watch birds. His bookshelf filled with accounting texts and mystery novels. The family photos that showed 38 years of birthdays, Christmases, graduations. She stopped in front of a photo from her wedding day. Edward stood beside her in his best suit, beaming with pride as he prepared to walk her down the aisle. The love in his eyes was unmistakable, uncomplicated by questions of DNA or blood relation. On the mantelpiece next to the photo sat 2 envelopes. One was Edward's original letter, the one where he admitted his uncertainties but reaffirmed his love. The other was a letter that had arrived last week from Phoenix. David Kellerman had written to her after the trial. His letter was brief but kind. Dear Margaret, I wanted you to know that I never intended to cause problems for your family. Uncle Ed spoke of you often in his letters over the years, and it was clear you were the center of his world. I am sorry for what you are going through. I hope you can find peace with everything that has happened. Your cousin. In all the ways that matter. David Fay. Margaret had cried when she read it. Even a stranger could see what she'd temporarily lost sight of. That family was about more than genetics. The money was hers now, legally and completely. But the victory felt hollow. She'd won Edward's estate by confessing to lies, and in doing so she'd lost her husband and her sense of herself as an honest person. Standing in Edward's living room, Margaret realized that the real inheritance hadn't been the money at all. It had been the love of a man who chose her as his daughter regardless of blood, who built a family through intention and care rather than genetics. She'd fought so hard to keep the financial inheritance that she'd almost forgotten the emotional one. But that inheritance, the memories, the love, the knowledge that she'd been chosen, couldn't be taken away by any court or any DNA test. Outside, autumn leaves were falling, covering Edward's perfectly maintained lawn. Margaret knew she should rake them, but for now, she just watched them fall, thinking about choices and consequences, about love and loss, about the difference between what we inherit and what we earn. The money would send her boys to college, would secure their future, would give them opportunities Edward would have wanted them to have. But Margaret knew now that the most important thing she could pass on to them wasn't financial security. It was the understanding that family was something you built, not something you were simply born into. That love was a choice you made every day. That trust, once broken, required a lifetime of small actions to rebuild. Margaret picked up Edward's letter and read it one more time. At the bottom, in his careful handwriting, were the words that mattered most. Faye, you are my daughter, Maggie. Blood or no blood, you are mine, and I am proud of the woman you've become. Asterisk, the money was hers now, but more than that, the love was hers too, had always been hers, would always be hers. Even if she'd forgotten